Yes, you're here again. Another episode. Subscribe or don't. Either way, you'll probably fall asleep before it's over. This story is about why being a medieval monk was harder than you think. Imagine being awakened at 2 o'clock in the morning, every morning, by the sound of a wooden clapper echoing through stone corridors so cold that your breath forms visible clouds in the darkness. You are Brother Thomas, a Benedictine monk in the Abbey of Saint-Denis, north of Paris, in the year 1147. The romantic image of peaceful monks tending gardens and copying beautiful manuscripts is about to be shattered by a reality so harsh that modern people would consider it a form of torture. The bell that wakes you isn't a gentle chime, it's a harsh metallic clang designed to cut through sleep like a blade. There's no snooze button, no possibility of rolling over for 5 more minutes. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governs every moment of your existence, is absolutely clear. When the bell rings for matins, you rise immediately. Failure to do so results in public penance that can include days of isolation, reduced food rations, or physical punishment. Your sleeping quarters, which archaeological excavations of medieval monasteries reveal were typically no larger than modern prison cells, contain nothing but a straw mattress on a wooden frame and a single woolen blanket. The temperature inside the dormitory during a typical 12th century winter regularly dropped below freezing. There was no heating, no insulation, nothing but the shared body heat of 40 other monks to keep the space from becoming literally lethal. The first challenge of your day isn't spiritual, it's simply surviving the transition from horizontal to vertical in conditions that would hospitalize modern people within hours. Your feet hit a stone floor so cold it feels like ice, and immediately you understand why so many medieval monks suffered from arthritis and joint problems that crippled them by middle age. You dress in darkness, by touch, in robes that provide minimal warmth and no comfort. The habit of a Benedictine monk consists of a rough woolen tunic, a scapular, and a hood. The fabric is deliberately coarse, designed to irritate the skin as a constant reminder of penance and humility. Modern textile analysis reveals that medieval monastic clothing was often infested with lice and other parasites that caused constant itching and skin infections. The walk to the chapel for matins takes you through corridors, lit only by a few flickering candles. The shadows dance on stone walls that weep with condensation, creating an atmosphere that's more tomb-like than peaceful. The silence is absolute and enforced. Speaking outside of designated times and places results in severe punishment. This isn't the comfortable quiet of a library. It's the oppressive silence of men who've been systematically stripped of one of humanity's most basic forms of communication. Matins itself lasts approximately 2 hours, during which you stand on a stone floor in an unheated chapel, chanting Latin prayers in darkness, broken only by a few oil lamps that provide barely enough light to read by. Your voice joins with those of your brothers in Gregorian chant that, while beautiful, serves a purpose beyond worship. It's designed to induce a trance-like state that makes the physical discomfort more bearable. But here's what romanticized accounts of monastic life never mention. By the time matins ends at 4 a.m., you've been awake and active for 2 hours in conditions that would challenge Arctic explorers. Your body temperature has dropped dangerously low, your joints ache from standing motionless on stone, and you still have 6 more prayer services to complete before the day ends. After matins comes a brief return to the dormitory, but not for rest. This is time for what medieval sources euphemistically call private devotion, a period during which many monks engaged in self-flagellation, wearing hair shirts or other forms of physical penance that modern psychology would recognize as self-harm. Archaeological evidence from monastic sites includes implements designed specifically for self-punishment: whips with metal tips, belts embedded with sharp points, chains worn around the waist until they cut into the flesh. The practice wasn't optional or extreme. It was considered essential for spiritual development. Monks who didn't engage in sufficient self-mortification were viewed as spiritually lazy and faced additional punishments imposed by their superiors. The scars and injuries resulting from these practices were worn as badges of devotion, visible proof of dedication to a life that modern people would consider abusive. Prime, the next prayer service, begins at 6 a.m. and lasts another hour. Then comes breakfast, and here's where another myth about monastic life crumbles completely. You don't eat a hearty meal to fuel your day. You consume a piece of bread, perhaps some thin porridge if you're fortunate, and water. That's it. The Benedictine rule explicitly limits food intake as a form of spiritual discipline, but analysis of medieval monastic remains reveals malnutrition levels that would trigger intervention from modern social services. During certain seasons, like Lent, the food restrictions become even more severe. Many monks consumed only one meal per day, consisting of bread and water, for weeks at a time. Modern medical analysis suggests that medieval monks suffered from chronic vitamin deficiencies, weakened immune systems, and stunted growth due to inadequate nutrition during their formative years. After this meagre breakfast comes the work period, and this is where the reality of monastic labor becomes clear. You're not gently tending a picturesque herb garden or peacefully copying illuminated manuscripts in a comfortable scriptorium. You're performing backbreaking agricultural labor, construction work, or other physically demanding tasks that were essential for the monastery's economic survival. Medieval monasteries were complex economic institutions that owned vast amounts of land and controlled significant resources. The labor that maintained these enterprises was provided by the monks themselves, working in conditions that would violate every modern labor law. 10-hour workdays were common, performed in all weather conditions with tools that were primitive by contemporary standards. If you were assigned to the scriptorium, the manuscript copying workshop that modern people imagine as peaceful scholarly work, the reality was equally harsh. You sat on a hard wooden stool for hours at a time, bent over parchment in light so dim that many scribes developed severe eye problems by middle age. The ink was made from materials that were often toxic, causing skin irritation and respiratory problems. The parchment itself, made from animal skins, carried a smell that modern people would find overwhelming. The work required absolute precision. A single mistake could ruin weeks of labor and result in severe punishment. Monks who made errors faced additional fasting, public humiliation, or assignment to the most unpleasant tasks in the monastery. The pressure to perform perfectly, combined with the physical discomfort of the work environment, created stress levels that would be considered harmful by modern standards. Midday brought sext, another hour-long prayer service, followed by the main meal of the day. But even this feast would shock modern people with its austerity. Vegetarian by necessity rather than choice, meat was forbidden except for the sick. The meal typically consisted of bread, vegetables, and perhaps some cheese or eggs. The portions were carefully measured to prevent overindulgence, which was considered a sin as serious as theft or violence. The afternoon work period was often the most challenging of the day. Physical labor in medieval conditions was dangerous and exhausting. Monks working in fields faced the constant risk of injury from primitive tools, disease from contaminated water, and accidents that could cripple or kill. Those assigned to construction work, and medieval monasteries were constantly being expanded or rebuilt, worked with heavy stones and wooden beams using techniques that would horrify modern safety inspectors. But perhaps most psychologically challenging was the constant surveillance and judgment by your fellow monks. Medieval monasteries operated on a system of mutual observation and reporting that would make modern totalitarian states envious. Every action, every word, every facial expression was noted and evaluated. Showing insufficient enthusiasm for prayer, eating too quickly, or displaying any sign of discontent could result in formal accusations and punishment. The hierarchy within the monastery was as rigid and unforgiving as any military organization. The abbot wielded absolute authority over every aspect of your life, from your daily tasks to your spiritual development. Below him, a complex system of officials monitored different aspects of monastic life: the prior, the cellarer, the master of novices, each with the power to make your existence more difficult if they judged your behavior unsatisfactory. Vespers, the evening prayer service, provided little relief from the day's hardships. Another hour of standing in an unheated chapel, chanting prayers while your stomach cramped from hunger and your body ached from the day's labor. The beautiful Gregorian melodies that modern people find peaceful were, for medieval monks, often a test of endurance rather than a source of comfort. The final meal of the day, a light supper consisting of bread and perhaps some fruit, was followed by Compline, the last prayer service before sleep. But even this wasn't the end of your obligations. Many monks were expected to spend additional time in private prayer, meditation, or reading religious texts by candlelight that strained their eyes and further disrupted their already inadequate sleep. The sleeping arrangements themselves were designed to prevent comfort. Medieval monasteries deliberately avoided anything that might make rest too pleasant, viewing physical comfort as spiritually dangerous. The dormitories were communal, offering no privacy whatsoever. The beds were intentionally uncomfortable, the blankets insufficient for warmth, the overall environment calculated to make sleep a necessity rather than a pleasure. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of medieval monastic life was the complete loss of personal autonomy. Every decision, from what you ate to how you spent your time, was made by others according to rules written centuries before your birth. You owned nothing, controlled nothing, decided nothing. Your very thoughts were subject to scrutiny and correction by superiors who had the authority to impose penance for mental as well as physical transgressions. The vow of stability meant that once you entered the monastery, you were there for life. There was no leaving, no changing your mind, no escape from rules that might prove unbearable as years passed. Medieval records show that some monks did attempt to flee, but those who were caught faced punishments that could include imprisonment, public beating, or even death in extreme cases. Mental health, as we understand it today, was not a recognized concept in medieval monasteries. Monks who showed signs of what we would now identify as depression, anxiety, or other psychological disorders were viewed as spiritually weak or possessed by demons. The treatments for such conditions often involved increased physical punishment, extended isolation, or exorcism rituals that would be considered torture by modern standards. Yet somehow, in this environment of systematic deprivation and psychological pressure, some monks did find genuine spiritual fulfillment. The letters and writings that survive from medieval monasteries occasionally reveal moments of transcendent peace, profound religious experience, and deep satisfaction with a life dedicated to service and prayer. These glimpses of authentic spirituality make the harsh conditions even more poignant. They suggest that some individuals were able to find meaning and purpose despite circumstances that would break most people. As night finally fell and the monastery settled into its brief period of rest, the silence that descended was different from the enforced quiet of daytime. This was the silence of exhaustion, of men who had pushed their bodies and minds to the limits of endurance in pursuit of spiritual goals that remained, for most, frustratingly elusive. The stone walls that surrounded you had witnessed generations of similar struggles, young men entering with hopes of finding peace and purpose, only to discover that the monastic life was a form of warfare against human nature itself. Some had thrived in this environment, becoming saints and scholars whose names survived in history. Others had broken under the pressure, leaving behind only brief mentions in administrative records that noted their failures with bureaucratic indifference. In your narrow bed, surrounded by the soft breathing of 40 other men who had made the same impossible choice, sleep finally came, not as relief, but as a temporary escape from conditions that would resume in just a few hours. Outside the monastery walls, the medieval world continued its violent and unpredictable course. But inside, the rhythm of prayer and penance continued unchanged, regardless of wars, plagues, or political upheavals. The darkness that settled over the monastery was profound and complete. No street lights, no electric hum, no distant traffic, just the absolute quiet of a world that slept when the sun set and woke when necessity demanded. In that darkness, even the harshest aspects of monastic life took on a different quality, becoming part of a larger pattern that had persisted for centuries and would continue long after your individual struggles were forgotten. Tomorrow would bring the same challenges: the pre-dawn bell, the cold chapel, the insufficient food, the demanding labor. But it would also bring the same opportunities for transcendence that had drawn men to monastic life despite its obvious hardships. The possibility that through complete submission to an impossibly difficult way of life, something greater might be achieved than what ordinary existence could offer. The monastery slept, its stone walls holding the quiet breathing of men who had chosen to transform suffering into purpose, who had found in the systematic rejection of comfort a path towards something they believed was worth any sacrifice. And in that sleep, however brief and uncomfortable, there was a peace that came not from the absence of hardship, but from the knowledge that they had endured another day in pursuit of goals that transcended individual survival or happiness. The ancient stones settled around them with barely audible sounds, as if the building itself was finally allowing itself to rest after another day of housing humanity's most ambitious spiritual experiment, the attempt to transform ordinary men into something approaching the divine through the simple but devastating method of making ordinary human life impossible to live.